Take a moment to picture a world without the reassuring weight of a wrought iron lock, the sturdy stone walls of a cathedral, or the familiar gleam of a cooking pot over a hearth. Imagine no plows to till the soil, no nails to hold a roof together, no swords to defend a kingdom. This wasn't some distant prehistoric age. This was the stark reality of early medieval Europe, a world waiting to be built, waiting for the right hands to harness the most primal of elements, fire and air. It was in the smoky glow of the forge and the intense heat of the kiln that ordinary people began to accomplish the extraordinary, bending nature itself to their will and setting in motion a transformation so profound it would reshape civilization. We often picture the Middle Ages through the lens of knights and castles, kings and battles, but behind every sword swung and every stone laid was a quieter, more fundamental revolution, the mastery of wind and flame by countless unknown artisans. In this video, we're going to step into their world. We'll explore how medieval kilns and forges, those unsung engines of progress, did far more than just produce tools or trinkets. They redefined what was possible, from the solitary village blacksmith patiently hammering out a hinge to the bustling monastic forges where innovation and devotion met. These workshops were hubs of ingenuity that touched every aspect of daily life. They turned raw earth into durable pottery, stubborn ore into flexible iron, and simple limestone into the mortar that held grand cathedrals aloft. This was where chemistry met craft, where patience met power, and where society itself was quite literally forged, piece by piece, fire by fire. So join us on a journey back through the smoke and sparks, to an era when human creativity burned brightest against the dark of uncertainty. We'll meet the inventors and laborers who tamed temperatures, designed furnaces, and passed down secrets through generations. We'll see how their legacy isn't confined to history books. It lives on in the technologies we still use, the buildings we admire, and the very infrastructure of modern life. By the end, you won't just see the medieval world differently. You'll feel the heat of their ambition and the breath of their innovation, and understand how these masters of wind and flame truly built the world we know today. Picture a European landscape in, say, the 8th century. The great stone halls of Roman Britain are long since ruins, overgrown and plundered for their materials. What remains are smaller, more isolated communities, each one largely responsible for its own survival. And at the edge of such a village, you would almost certainly find a simple, smoke-blackened pit dug into the earth, the heart of early medieval metallurgy. This was the humble beginning, the pit forge. It wasn't a grand workshop but a basic hole in the ground, lined with clay and stones to contain the fire. The blacksmith, a figure of immense practical importance, would labor here for hours, coaxing a bloom of iron to life. His most crucial tool wasn't his hammer, but his bellows. Often crafted from the hide of a goat or a cow, stitched together and operated by hand, these bellows were the primary source of airflow. With each squeeze, they would push a gust of air across the glowing charcoal, raising the temperature just enough to make the ore malleable. It was a painstaking physical process, a constant battle against the elements using the most basic of tools. The limitations of this setup were profound and dictated the pace of early medieval life. The temperatures achieved were frustratingly inconsistent, varying wildly with the skill of the person on the bellows and the quality of the charcoal. This inconsistency meant that iron often failed to reach its full melting point, resulting in a spongy, slag-riddled mass known as a bloom. The smith would then have to spend hours, sometimes days, hammering this bloom at a white heat to painstakingly pound out the impurities, the rock and waste material known as slag. The resulting wrought iron was serviceable but often weak, brittle, or uneven. You couldn't forge a long, reliable sword from such material. It might snap in battle. What you could make were smaller, simpler items: nails, hinges, basic farming tools like sickles or hoe blades, and rudimentary knives. The scale of production was minuscule. A single smith might only produce a few kilograms of usable iron in a week, enough for his local village and little more. This wasn't an industry, it was a vital yet severely constrained cottage craft. Yet the demand for better metal was a constant drumbeat pressure from every level of society. A farmer needed a more durable plowshare to turn the stubborn, rocky soil to feed his family and his lord. A carpenter needed sharper, stronger chisels and saws to shape the timber for homes and fortifications. And perhaps most pressingly, a local chieftain or a rising king needed reliable weapons and armor to defend his lands and expand his influence. A poorly made spearhead could mean the difference between life and death for a warrior, and the inability to produce enough nails could halt the construction of a defensive palisade. This societal need for survival, for prosperity, for power was the relentless engine driving innovation. The early medieval period wasn't a dark age of technological stagnation. It was an era of simmering potential, where the evident shortcomings of the pit forge and the clay kiln were clear to every smith who struggled with them. They knew there had to be a better way, a method to harness fire and air with greater control and greater force. This recognition, this pressing need born from daily necessity, set the stage for everything that was to come. The desire for stronger plows, sharper swords, and more durable tools was the kindling, waiting for the spark of ingenuity to ignite a revolution in flame and iron. So if the simple pit forge was the starting point, the true engine of progress for creating more than just metal was the kiln. While the blacksmith worked his magic on iron, another set of artisans were mastering fire to transform earth itself. The medieval kiln was a far more sophisticated structure, a permanent fixture in the landscape that represented a huge leap in controlled heat application. Its primary purpose was to create a consistent, enclosed environment where temperatures could be raised high enough to chemically alter materials, turning soft, fragile clay into hard, durable pottery or ceramic tiles, and transforming limestone into quicklime, the essential ingredient for the mortar that built castles and cathedrals. Unlike the temporary pit forge, a kiln was a significant investment of labor and materials, designed to be used over and over again, and its design was a marvel of practical engineering. The most common design was known as an updraft kiln, and its anatomy was elegantly straightforward yet required immense skill to operate. Picture a large, rounded chamber built from stones or fire-resistant bricks, often partially sunk into the ground or built against a hillside for insulation and structural support. At the very bottom was the firebox, the heart of the operation where the fuel, whether wood, charcoal, or peat, was steadily fed to create a roaring fire. Directly above this was the firing chamber, where the precious cargo was carefully stacked. Pots were nested together or tiles were stood on their edges on raised shelves called kiln furniture, all arranged to allow the scorching heat to circulate evenly around every single piece. The entire structure was then sealed shut with a temporary dome of clay or a massive lid, leaving only a small opening at the very top. This was the flue, and it was the masterstroke of the design. By controlling this opening, the kiln master could carefully manage the draft, pulling the heat and flames from the firebox below up through the stacked ware and out the top. This created a controlled, even flow of heat that baked everything inside uniformly. The choice of fuel was a critical decision, deeply influenced by geography and economics. In heavily forested areas, wood was the obvious and plentiful choice, though it burned quickly and could leave behind ash that might mar the surface of fine pottery. For a cleaner, hotter, and more consistent burn, nothing surpassed charcoal. Its use was a sign of a serious operation aiming for high-quality results, especially for glazed ware or lime production, though its higher cost meant it was often reserved for the most important firings. In regions like parts of England or Ireland where trees were scarce, peat cut from bogs became the fuel of necessity, its dense, smouldering burn requiring even greater skill to manage. The kiln master had to understand the personality of his fuel intimately, knowing exactly how to feed the fire to maintain the precise temperature curve needed for the specific material inside. This was where art met science. The entire process was a days-long, high-stakes ballet of fire management. After the kiln was loaded and sealed, the fire was started slowly to drive out any remaining moisture from the clay or limestone, a critical phase where heating too quickly would cause trapped water to turn to steam and make the pieces literally explode. Once the kiln was bone dry, the temperature was gradually raised over many hours to its peak, often reaching well over 1,000 degrees Celsius for pottery and even higher for lime. The kiln master and his apprentices would take shifts around the clock, tirelessly feeding the fire and constantly reading the color of the flames and the glow from the spy holes to gauge the temperature inside. They worked by sight and experience, knowing that a yellow-orange glow meant one temperature range, while a brilliant white heat signaled another. There were no thermometers. This knowledge was earned through years of practice and passed down wisdom. A moment of inattention, a sudden downdraft of wind, or a misjudgment in fuel could lead to disaster. Underfiring would result in weak, porous pots that would crumble or leak, while overfiring could cause ceramics to slump and melt into a useless, vitrified mass. A single failed firing could represent weeks of labor and valuable materials going up in smoke, a devastating economic loss for the potter or lime burner. Yet, despite the pressure, the kiln yard was rarely a place of solitary work. It was a community hub, a gathering point where knowledge was exchanged as freely as the heat. While the kiln master held ultimate authority, the firing was a collective effort. Apprentices learned by doing, by listening to the stories of past firings and the lessons learned from failures. Neighbors might stop by, drawn by the mesmerizing glow against the night sky, sharing news and watching the spectacle. When the firing was complete and the kiln was left to cool for another day or two, the unsealing was a moment of shared anticipation and anxiety, a reveal that would judge the skill of the craftsman and determine the wealth of his household. In this way, the kiln was far more than a tool. It was a living classroom, a social center, and a powerful symbol of a community's ability to harness nature's raw power to create something both functional and beautiful. While the kiln mastered the art of transforming earth, another workshop held a different kind of power over medieval life, a place of rhythmic hammer blows, roaring flames, and the sharp, metallic scent of hot iron. This was the blacksmith's forge, the absolute heart of village industry and innovation. If the kiln was a controlled oven, the forge was a living, breathing beast, a contained sun that the smith learned to command. Its components were deceptively simple, yet each one was a masterpiece of functional design perfected over centuries. At its core was the hearth, a stone or clay-lined firepot where charcoal burned with an intense, focused heat. It was here that the magic began, where lumps of iron were buried in the fuel and brought to a glowing, plastic state. Hovering just above or to the side of this fiery heart stood the anvil, a massive block of iron, often mounted on a great stump of wood that absorbed the shock of countless blows. This was the stage where the transformation happened, where the smith's vision met the metal's resistance. The tools that bridged the gap between the smith's intent and the stubborn iron were extensions of his own hands. A set of long-handled tongs, their jaws carefully shaped to grip specific items, allowed him to maneuver the searing hot metal from fire to anvil and back again without fear. His hammers were not crude mallets but precision instruments of different weights and face shapes, some broad for drawing out metal, others cross-peened for stretching it, and some rounded for shaping curves. But the most vital tool for controlling the forge's very essence was the bellows. Unlike the simple animal skin bags of earlier times, the medieval smith often used a more efficient double-chambered bellows made of wood and leather. By working a handle, he could create a continuous stream of air, forcing oxygen into the base of the fire and superheating the charcoal to temperatures that could make iron glow a brilliant yellow-white, almost ready to spark and melt. And finally, standing ready nearby was the water trough, a simple barrel or stone basin that held a dark, mysterious power all its own. This was for quenching, the dramatic moment when a red-hot piece of steel was plunged into the water with a violent hiss and cloud of steam, instantly locking in the hardness the fire had given it. The process of creation was a physical, almost musical performance. A smith would begin by building a deep, hot fire in the hearth, using his bellows to bring it to the right temperature. He'd then bury a piece of iron in the coals, watching carefully for the color to change from dull red to a bright, almost blinding yellow, the signal that the metal had reached its most malleable state. With a swift, practiced motion, he'd pull it from the fire with his tongs, transfer it to the anvil, and begin to hammer. The rhythm was not random, each strike had a purpose. To draw out a point for a spear, he would hammer along the length, stretching the metal. To create a curve for a hinge or a handle, he would work the edges. If the metal began to cool and turn from yellow to orange, losing its plasticity, it was immediately returned to the fire to be reheated. This cycle, heat, hammer, heat again, could repeat dozens of times for a single object. The final, critical step for tools and weapons was heat treatment. After the item was shaped, it would be heated once more and then quenched in the water trough to make it hard, but often too brittle. To perfect it, the smith would gently reheat it on the edge of the fire, tempering it to a specific color. A pale straw yellow for a razor-sharp edge on a sword, or a deeper blue for a springy, durable saw blade. This was the pinnacle of the smith's art, a secret alchemy of sight and feel passed from master to apprentice. Beyond the technical skill, the blacksmith occupied a unique and almost mystical place in the medieval social order. He was the community's essential artisan, the one man who could create the tools for every other trade. The farmer needed his plowshare and hoe, the carpenter his nails and saws, the wheelwright his iron rims and axles, and the housewife her cooking pot and fireplace tools. But his power over fire and metal, his ability to make the very earth itself flow like liquid and then solidify into a new, stronger form, seemed like supernatural alchemy to the average villager. In an age where explanations were often rooted in mystery and magic, the smith was a revered and sometimes feared figure. Folklore across Europe is filled with tales of magical smiths, like the Germanic hero Wieland or the British figure Whale, and the smith, who could forge unbreakable swords and wings to fly. The smithy itself was a place of community gathering, a warm haven in winter where news was exchanged, disputes were settled, and the rhythms of village life were set to the ringing of the hammer on the anvil. This humble, smoky workshop with its 4 simple tools was far more than a business. It was the birthplace of medieval industry, the repair shop for the community, and a forge for the very fabric of society itself. But for all the skill of the blacksmith and the kiln master, they were fundamentally limited by one simple, yet stubborn, element of nature: air. A fire, no matter how well built, can only burn as hot as the oxygen feeding it allows. This was the great bottleneck of early medieval industry. The simple hand bellows, while a vital tool, were exhausting to operate and could only provide short, inconsistent bursts of air. A smith needed an apprentice solely to work the bellows, a tiring and monotonous job that limited the duration and intensity of a heating cycle. The true revolution, the moment when medieval metallurgy truly learned to roar, came with the mastery of artificial wind. This was the era of mechanical bellows, an innovation that turned a gentle breeze into a continuous, controllable blast, forever changing what was possible within the forge and the furnace. The earliest improvement was a matter of simple mechanical advantage. The double-chambered bellows, often made from a wooden box structure with a leather diaphragm, became a common sight in better-equipped workshops. By stepping on a pedal or working a lever, the smith could force air out of one chamber while the other refilled, creating a much more consistent and powerful stream than the old bag bellows could ever hope to produce. This was a significant step forward, but it was still reliant on human muscle. The real game changer arrived with the integration of water power. In the High Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th century onward, enterprising artisans began connecting their bellows to the relentless, untiring force of water wheels. A simple system of cams and rods would translate the rotating motion of the wheel into a pumping action, driving a set of massive bellows that could be taller than a man. This was no longer a gust of air. It was a constant, powerful blast, a true artificial wind that could be maintained for hours, days, or even weeks without fatigue. The science behind this is simple yet profound. Combustion is a chemical reaction between a fuel and oxygen. The more oxygen you can deliver to the fire, the more completely and efficiently the fuel burns, and the higher the temperature climbs. With hand bellows, a fire might reach temperatures sufficient to soften iron for forging, around 800 degrees Celsius. But with the relentless blast of a water-powered bellows system, temperatures could soar well past 1,200 degrees. This was the critical threshold. At these extreme heats, something miraculous happened. Iron ore didn't just become soft, it actually melted. For the first time in Northern Europe, artisans could produce liquid iron, which could be poured into molds like water. This was the birth of cast iron on a significant scale. Theophilus Presbyter, a 12th century monk and author of the seminal technical manual on diverse arts, captured the awe this technology inspired. He described the operation of these powerful bellows, marveling at how they produced a continuous blast of wind that made the furnace vomit flames. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a fundamental shift in capability. This mastery of wind was every bit as vital as the control of flame itself. It enabled the development of the blast furnace, a towering structure designed to operate continuously for weeks at a time, producing vast quantities of high-quality iron. It made possible the more consistent production of high-carbon steel, a material that was harder, stronger, and could take a much sharper edge, revolutionizing everything from weaponry to woodworking tools. The water-powered bellows turned metallurgy from a skilled craft into an early form of industry, increasing output exponentially and improving quality dramatically. The ability to generate and sustain these artificial winds meant that the limitations of human breath and muscle were finally overcome. The forge fire could now burn with the intensity of a dragon's breath, and with that power, medieval craftsmen began to build a new world. But all that fire, all that magnificent artificial wind screaming through a furnace, required something crucial to feed it. You couldn't just throw any old log on a fire and hope to melt iron or fire fine pottery. The unsung hero, the absolute lifeblood of this entire fiery revolution, was a substance that seems deceptively simple: charcoal. This wasn't just burned wood, it was wood transformed, condensed into a nearly pure form of carbon through a process that was as much art as it was industry. While the blacksmith and the potter worked in the heart of the community, the charcoal burner or collier worked in solitude deep in the woods, performing a slow, smoky alchemy that made every other advancement possible. The production of charcoal was a meticulous and ancient ritual, one that hadn't changed much for centuries. It began with a careful selection of wood. Hardwoods like oak, beech, and hornbeam were preferred for their density, which translated into a longer, hotter burn. The collier and his team would first cut and split the timber into uniform lengths. Then, on a level patch of ground, they would begin constructing a carefully engineered mound, known as a clamp. They started with a central chimney, often just a bundle of sticks, and then painstakingly stacked the split wood in a circular or dome-shaped pile around it, each piece placed to allow for just the right amount of airflow. The entire structure, which could be as large as a small cottage, was then sealed. The collier would smother the wood pile in a thick layer of damp leaves, turf, and earth, creating an airtight seal that was absolutely critical. The goal was not to let the wood burn openly, but to bake it in its own gases. Once the clamp was sealed, the collier would drop a few hot embers down the central chimney to start the process. What followed was not a fire, but a smoldering, oxygen-starved pyrolysis. The wood inside began to cook, releasing volatile gases, water, and tar that were driven off as smoke, leaving behind the lightweight, black, porous carbon skeleton we know as charcoal. This is where the collier's true skill shone. For the next several days and nights, he could not leave his post. He had to constantly tend the mound, watching the color and density of the smoke pouring from small vent holes he had strategically poked in the earthen cover. Thick, yellow smoke meant the process was still driving off impurities. As it turned a thin, bluish gray, he knew the conversion was nearing completion. He'd constantly be patching the earthen seal, smothering any cracks where a flame might break out and consume his entire precious charge into worthless ash. It was a sleepless, lonely vigil, a constant battle to control a slow-burning fire without ever letting it truly flame. After days of this careful tending, the smoke would finally clear, signaling the end. The clamp was then sealed completely and left to cool for another day or two before the collier could carefully break it open to reveal the glittering, black treasure within. From a massive mound of heavy wood, he would yield a much smaller pile of lightweight, fragile charcoal, a condensed form of potential energy. So why go through all this immense trouble? Why not just burn the wood directly? The answer lies in the fundamental chemistry of the fuel. Raw wood is full of impurities, water, sap, and resins that burn inefficiently, creating a smoky, uneven flame that struggles to reach high temperatures. Charcoal, by contrast, is almost pure carbon. It burns far hotter and, most importantly, much cleaner than wood. In a forge or a kiln, this was a monumental advantage. A charcoal fire could achieve the searing temperatures needed to smelt iron ore or fire stoneware with a consistency that wood simply could not match. The absence of all those impurities meant there was far less smoke and, critically for metalworkers, far fewer contaminants like sulfur that could make iron brittle and weak. For a blacksmith trying to weld two pieces of metal together, a single pocket of sap in a wood log could release a burst of flame that would oxidize the metal's surface, ruining the weld. Charcoal provided a stable, predictable, and intensely hot bed of coals that was the perfect tool for precision work. It was the high-performance fuel of its day, the difference between a sputtering campfire and a precision blowtorch. The economic and environmental consequences of this demand were staggering. A single, moderately sized forge might consume the charcoal from an entire acre of woodland in just 1 week. A large blast furnace operating continuously was a ravenous beast that could devour a forest in a matter of months. This voracious appetite for fuel created an entire industry around charcoal production, employing thousands of colliers, woodcutters, and carters who managed the harvesting, production, and transportation of this essential commodity. It also fundamentally reshaped the European landscape. In some areas, this led to sophisticated systems of forest management. Woodlands became valuable assets owned by lords or monasteries who would coppice trees, cutting them back to the stump to encourage straight, fast-growing shoots that could be harvested on a cyclical basis, creating a sustainable yield of wood for the charcoal clamps. This was an early form of renewable resource management born from industrial necessity. But in other regions, particularly those with concentrated industrial activity, the result was rampant deforestation. Vast swaths of ancient woodland were cleared and never regrew, leading to soil erosion, loss of habitat, and even changes in local climate. The need for charcoal became a source of conflict, pitting ironmasters against farmers who needed the land for grazing, and against communities who relied on the forests for hunting, foraging, and building materials. Laws were passed to try to protect remaining woodlands, a clear sign that medieval societies were grappling with the environmental cost of their own progress. The charcoal burner, working alone in his smoky clearing, was thus a key figure at the center of a vast economic web. His product was the essential catalyst, the condensed energy source that fed the forges and kilns, which in turn built everything from a peasant's cooking pot to a king's armor. Without this black, brittle substance, the flames of innovation would have flickered and died, and the medieval world would have remained forged in far weaker fire. So the charcoal is ready, the furnace is built, and the demand for iron is pressing. But how did medieval metalworkers actually turn the reddish, rocky earth of iron ore into a bar of usable metal? This crucial alchemy happened in a structure known as the bloomery furnace, and the process, called smelting, was a brutal, day-long battle of heat, chemistry, and sheer physical endurance. It was here, in these simple stone or clay towers, that the first true transformation occurred, where stone was persuaded to give up its metallic heart. The design of a bloomery furnace was a study in practical efficiency. Unlike a kiln designed for even heat, the bloomery was built for intense, localized inferno. It was typically a cylindrical shaft about waist-high, constructed from stones packed with clay to withstand the tremendous heat. At its base was an opening, the tire, where the nozzle of the bellows would be inserted to blast air directly into the heart of the fire. The process began by building a charcoal fire at the bottom of the furnace. Once it was roaring, the smelter would begin alternating layers of fresh charcoal and crushed iron ore. The ore itself was rarely pure. It was often gathered from bogs or shallow mines and had to be roasted in a separate fire first to drive off some moisture and break it down into smaller, more manageable pieces. This careful layering was critical. Too much ore and the fire would be smothered, too little and the process would be inefficient. For hours, the smelter and his team would tirelessly feed the furnace and work the bellows, maintaining that relentless artificial wind, watching as the intense heat did its work. Inside the furnace, a complex chemical ballet was taking place. The burning charcoal produced carbon monoxide, a gas that is hungry for oxygen. As this gas rose through the layers of ore, it stole oxygen atoms from the iron oxide, effectively reducing the ore to its metallic form. The temperature, carefully maintained between 1,100 and 1,200 degrees Celsius, was hot enough to soften the iron and melt the rocky impurities, known as gangue, but not hot enough to melt the pure iron itself. Instead, over the course of many hours, the microscopic particles of now purified iron would gradually coalesce, dripping down through the charcoal and collecting at the bottom of the furnace into a spongy, glowing mass mixed with liquid slag. This mass is what we call the bloom, a lump of iron that is still riddled with pockets of stony waste and pockets of air, a promising but crude beginning. The most dramatic and physically demanding part of the entire process came next, the extraction and forging of the bloom. Once the smelting was complete, the front of the furnace would be broken open to reveal the prize within, a white-hot, porous lump of iron weighing anywhere from 10 to 50 pounds, shimmering with molten slag. Using long poles and heavy tongs, the smiths would wrestle this incredibly heavy, incandescent mass out of the furnace and onto a large stone or a heavy wooden block. Then, with the biggest hammers they had, they would begin to beat it. This was not precision work. This was a test of pure strength and stamina. The goal was to use the force of the hammer blows to literally squeeze the liquid slag out of the spongy iron. With each thunderous strike, sparks and glowing droplets of silicon-based waste would fly in all directions, a spectacular and dangerous shower of fire. The bloom would have to be constantly reheated in a forge fire to keep it malleable enough to work, and the hammering would continue until the mass was consolidated into a denser, more solid block. The final result of this exhausting effort was a rough chunk of wrought iron. The term wrought literally means worked, and this metal was named for the immense labor required to create it. It was a relatively soft, fibrous metal, tough and durable, but still a far cry from the hardened steel needed for weapons. This bloom of wrought iron was the fundamental raw material, the essential ingot from which almost every other iron object would later be fashioned by the village blacksmith. The challenges faced by these early smelters were immense and constant. Nothing about the process was guaranteed. The quality of the ore varied wildly from region to region. Some deposits might be rich in iron, while others were too lean to be worth the enormous fuel expenditure. Maintaining the precise, high temperature inside the furnace for hours on end was a delicate art. A sudden change in wind, a lapse in bellows work, or a misjudgment in the charcoal-to-ore ratio could result in a failed smelt, yielding nothing but a useless mass of semi-vitrified slag and half-reduced ore, a week's worth of labor and valuable fuel utterly wasted. And the physical toll on the workers was staggering. The heat, the smoke, the sheer brute force required to hammer the bloom. It was a job for the strongest and most resilient members of the community. Despite these overwhelming difficulties, they persevered, because this process, this first transformation of rock into metal, was the essential foundation upon which everything else was built. Every nail that held a house together, every plowshare that turned the soil to grow food, every axe that felled the trees for timber, and every hammer that shaped the world started its life as a bloom pulled from the fiery heart of a simple furnace. It was the primal act of creation, the moment humanity took the minerals of the earth and began to weave them into the very fabric of civilization. For centuries, the rhythm of the forge was set by the pounding of a human heart and the heaving of human lungs. The bellows were worked by hand, the hammers were swung by arm, and the scale of production was limited by sheer physical endurance. But then, a new rhythm emerged, one dictated not by muscle, but by the relentless, untiring flow of a river. The integration of the water wheel into metallurgy was perhaps the single most transformative innovation of the entire medieval period, a leap that turned a skilled craft into a true industry and fundamentally redefined humanity's relationship with power. This was the dawn of mechanized production, and it began with the simple, brilliant idea of letting nature do the heaviest lifting. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. A stream or river was diverted to channel water over a large, paddled wheel. The weight and flow of the water turned the wheel, and this rotational energy was then transferred via a complex system of wooden gears, shafts, and cams. This machinery could be adapted to perform two crucial back-breaking tasks. The first was to operate massive trip hammers. These were enormous wooden hammers, often shod with iron, mounted on a pivot. As the water wheel turned, it lifted the hammers and then released them to drop with a thunderous force onto the metal below, capable of pounding a bloom of iron in a fraction of the time it took a man with a sledgehammer. The second, and perhaps even more vital application, was to power giant bellows. The water wheel could drive a set of bellows so large that they stood taller than a person, delivering a continuous, powerful, and perfectly consistent blast of air into the heart of a furnace. This constant artificial wind was the key to unlocking temperatures that were previously unimaginable, making the large-scale production of cast iron a reality. This revolutionary technology didn't appear everywhere at once. It flourished in regions blessed with the right combination of fast-flowing water and abundant raw materials. In the Rhineland of Germany, the dense forests provided the charcoal, the hills provided the ore, and the numerous rivers provided the power. Here, entire industrial complexes known as fining forges and Osmond furnaces sprang up, their water wheels driving hammers that worked the iron and bellows that stoked the fires day and night. Similarly, in the valleys of Yorkshire and the Forest of Dean in England, the landscape became dotted with these water-powered hammer mills or hammer mills. The constant, rhythmic thump of the trip hammers became the sound of progress, echoing through the valleys and signaling a massive increase in production. These weren't just bigger versions of a village smithy, they were the factories of the Middle Ages. The impact of this shift from human power to water power was nothing short of revolutionary. The most immediate effect was a staggering increase in the quantity of iron produced. A single water-powered forge could output in 1 week what might have taken a traditional smithy months to produce. This iron was also of a more consistent and reliable quality. The relentless, machine-powered hammering squeezed out far more slag than human arms ever could, resulting in a purer, more uniform wrought iron. And the powerful, steady blast from the mechanical bellows allowed for better control over the carbon content of the metal, leading to more predictable and higher quality steel. This abundance of good iron had a ripple effect across the entire economy and society. It meant that large-scale construction projects, like the great Gothic cathedrals soaring into the sky, could be undertaken with confidence. They required thousands of iron cramps to hold stone blocks together, massive iron ties for roof structures, and intricate iron window tracery, all of which became economically feasible with water-powered production. Perhaps one of the most profound social impacts was the liberation of human labor. No longer did a strong apprentice need to spend his entire day monotonously working the bellows or swinging a sledgehammer. That brute force work was now handled by the water wheel. This freed up skilled craftsmen to focus on the more intricate and sophisticated aspects of their trade, the precise shaping, the careful welding, and the art of heat treatment. It accelerated the specialization of labor, allowing some smiths to become masters of specific products like nails, tools, or weapons, further improving quality and efficiency. The water-powered forge marked the definitive shift from an economy based on manual craftsmanship to one embracing mechanical power, setting a direct precedent for the spinning jenny and the steam engine that would fuel the Industrial Revolution centuries later. It was a quiet, hydraulic revolution that began in the secluded river valleys of medieval Europe, but its echoes would eventually be heard around the world. While the water-powered forges along the river valleys represented the muscle of medieval industry, The true intellect, the relentless drive for refinement and understanding, was often found within the quiet, contemplative walls of monasteries. In an age before universities and public libraries, these religious communities became the unexpected but vital guardians of technological progress. Isolated from the constant turmoil of feudal life, monasteries provided the stability, resources, and scholarly environment necessary for long-term experimentation and record-keeping. Within their precincts, the spiritual pursuit of perfection found a parallel in the material world, as monks applied their discipline and devotion to mastering the elements of wind and flame, transforming their workshops into some of the most advanced centers of production and innovation in all of Europe. The monastic forge and kiln were far more than just workshops to support the daily needs of the abbey. They were laboratories for applied science. Benedictine monks, following their rule of ora et labora, pray and work, saw manual labor as a form of devotion. This philosophical framework elevated craftsmanship to a spiritual practice. A monk working at a forge wasn't just making a hinge for a door. He was participating in the divine act of creation, transforming God's raw materials into something useful and beautiful for His glory. This mindset encouraged a culture of patience, precision, and continuous improvement that was often absent in the commercial, time-sensitive world of the village smithy. Monks had the luxury of time to experiment with different ore sources, to test new alloy mixtures of copper, tin, and lead, and to carefully record the effects of varying temperatures on different metals. They meticulously preserved techniques from classical Roman texts that might otherwise have been lost, translating and annotating them, and then putting those ancient recipes to the test alongside their own empirical discoveries. Their output was astonishingly diverse, blending the practical with the sublime. Of course, they produced the necessary tools for their own vast agricultural estates: plowshares, scythes, and horseshoes. But their skills also extended to highly specialized artistic and liturgical work. It was often monastic workshops that produced the exquisite metalwork for reliquaries, the delicate crucifixes, and the intricate chalices used in Mass. Their forges produced the armatures, the internal iron skeletons, that held together towering stained glass windows, allowing those narratives of light to soar in cathedrals. Their kilns were equally versatile, firing not only roof tiles and floor tiles for their own expansive buildings, but also producing the brilliant glazed tiles that adorned chapels and the fine ceramics used in the abbey's kitchen and infirmary. In many ways, the monastery was a self-sufficient industrial complex, but one whose products reached far beyond its walls through trade and gift-giving, spreading its technological influence across the continent. Most importantly, monasteries were centers of literacy in a largely illiterate world. The knowledge gained through centuries of trial and error in the forge and kiln was not hoarded as a secret trade. It was diligently recorded in illuminated manuscripts. Encyclopedic works like the 12th century De Diversis Artibus on Diverse Arts by the monk Theophilus Presbyter provide a stunningly detailed window into these practices. Theophilus didn't just describe how to build a furnace, he gave precise instructions on how to cast bells, how to forge a sword, how to create alloys for soldering, and how to produce the pigments for stained glass. These manuscripts were copied and sent to other monasteries, creating a network of shared technical knowledge that spanned Christendom. This commitment to recording and disseminating information ensured that hard-won innovations were preserved and built upon, rather than being lost with the death of a single master craftsman. This unique environment, where faith and science were not in opposition but in harmony, allowed monks to become pioneers of industrial innovation. Their spiritual devotion fostered a long-term perspective that valued sustainable practices, such as coppicing woodlands for charcoal to ensure a perpetual supply. Their scholarly habits encouraged meticulous observation and the systematic comparison of results. The monastic forge was a place where prayer and precision met, where the rhythm of the bellows was kept to the rhythm of the liturgical hours. In these sacred workshops, the medieval world found a powerful engine for progress, proving that the quest for spiritual understanding could walk hand in hand with the mastery of the material world, leaving a legacy of knowledge that would fuel advancements for centuries to come. While the forge provided the fire and the bellows provided the wind, the true magic happened in the smith's hands, guided by a set of tools that were both brutally simple and exquisitely refined. This toolkit was not just a collection of implements, it was an extension of the craftsman's own body and will, each piece honed by generations of practice to perform a specific, vital task in the dance of transformation. The most fundamental of these, the very symbol of the trade, was the hammer. But to think of it as a single tool is to misunderstand the smith's art entirely. A master would own a whole family of hammers, each with a distinct personality and purpose. The most common was the cross-peen hammer, its head ending in a wedge perpendicular to the handle. This was the primary tool for drawing out metal, for stretching a glowing bar of iron lengthwise to form a point or a taper. The flat face was for general forging and smoothing, while the peen concentrated force into a narrow line, allowing the smith to control the metal's flow with incredible precision. Heavier sledgehammers, often wielded by a strong apprentice under the master's direction, were for the heavy work of initial shaping and consolidating a bloom. The size, weight, and balance of each hammer were a matter of personal preference, often custom-made or carefully modified until it felt like a natural extension of the arm. If the hammer was the hand that shaped, then the tongs were the fingers that held. This was perhaps the most underappreciated tool in the workshop, yet without it, the entire process would be impossible. A smith would have dozens of pairs of tongs, each set of jaws carefully forged to grip a specific shape. Flat jaws for holding sheet metal, round jaws for gripping bars, and square or V-shaped jaws for angled stock. The fit had to be perfect. A loose grip meant a red-hot piece of iron could fly across the workshop with lethal force. The length of the reins, the handles, was also critical, providing just the right leverage to hold a heavy object steady while keeping the smith's hands a safe distance from the searing heat. Watching a skilled smith work was to see a ballet of tongs. He might use one pair to hold the work and another, smaller pair in his other hand to manipulate a smaller component, all while constantly shifting his grip to present the perfect angle to the hammer. The tongs were his connection to the fire, the vital link that allowed him to orchestrate the metal's transformation. And at the center of it all stood the anvil, the immutable foundation upon which every strike landed. This was not merely a block of metal, it was the forge's sacred altar, a mass of wrought iron often weighing over 200 pounds, its top face forged from a harder steel to resist deformation. Its familiar shape, with a long horn at one end and a square tail at the other, was a masterpiece of functional design. The flat face or table was the main work surface. The horn, a gracefully curving cone, was used for forging curves and circles, like the links of a chain or the hoop of a barrel. The square table or heel often contained two holes of vital importance: the hardy hole, which held various bottom tools like cutters and bending forks, and the smaller pritchel hole, used for punching holes through hot metal. The sharp edge where the face met the horn was used for forging sharp angles. Every part of the anvil had a purpose, and its resonant ring, a clear, high-pitched tone when struck correctly, was the music to which the smith worked. A well-made anvil didn't just absorb the hammer's blow, it rebounded it, returning energy to the smith's arm and making the work less fatiguing. It was the heart of the workshop, and its condition often reflected the skill and prosperity of the smith himself. Beyond these three essentials lay a universe of specialized tools that spoke to the vast scope of the blacksmith's work. Chisels, both hot and cold, were used for cutting metal. A hot chisel used on glowing iron had a relatively thin, acute angle and could slice through the soft metal with surprising ease. A cold chisel for cutting cooled metal was much sturdier with a blunter angle to withstand the greater force required. Punches of various sizes and shapes were used to drive holes through hot iron, whether for a rivet or a decorative design. Fullers, which looked like rounded chisels, were used to create grooves or to draw out metal faster than a hammer face could. Swagers were bottom tools with specific impressions used to form metal into precise shapes like square or round bars. And then there were the finishing tools, files for smoothing edges, rasps for shaping wood or horn handles, and set hammers for creating clean, flat finishes. This entire arsenal was typically forged by the smith himself, a rite of passage that ensured each tool was perfectly suited to his hand and his methods. The creation of his own tools was the ultimate test of his skill, a project that demanded an understanding of heat treatment, geometry, and balance that could only be earned through years of experience. This intimate knowledge of every groove, every weight, and every balance point in his toolkit is what separated the true master from the mere apprentice, allowing him to perform feats of metalworking that seemed less like craft and more like pure magic. While the roaring forges of the blacksmith captured the imagination, another, quieter form of alchemy was taking place in workshops dedicated to a more delicate element, clay. The pottery kiln was the heart of this transformation, a specialized furnace where earth and water were reborn through fire into objects of both mundane necessity and breathtaking beauty. Unlike the open hearth of a forge, the pottery kiln was a sealed chamber, a controlled environment designed not for brute force but for precise, sustained heat that could work a more subtle magic on the minerals within the clay. The most common and enduring design was the updraft kiln, a structure that perfectly balanced simplicity with remarkable effectiveness. Imagine a rounded, beehive-shaped oven built from stone and clay bricks, often partially buried in the ground for better insulation and stability. At its base was the firebox where the potter would steadily feed wood or charcoal to build the fire. Directly above this, separated by a perforated floor of fire-resistant tiles called the kiln floor, was the firing chamber. This was where the carefully dried pots, bowls, and tiles were stacked, arranged with painstaking care on shelves to allow the scorching air to circulate freely around every piece. The entire structure was then sealed with a temporary clay or brick dome, leaving only a small opening at the very top to act as a flue. This design created a natural convection current. The hot air and flames from the firebox would rise up through the stacked ware, transferring their heat before finally escaping out the top. By carefully managing the size of this flue opening, the kiln master could control the draft and thus the temperature with surprising precision. The journey from a lump of wet clay to a finished pot was a long and patient one, fraught with potential for disaster at every stage. It began with the clay itself, which was dug from local pits, purified of stones and roots, and then kneaded and wedged to achieve a perfectly uniform consistency, free of air bubbles that could cause an explosion in the kiln. The potter would then form the vessels either by hand using coils of clay or, for more uniform pieces, on a simple kick wheel that allowed him to spin the clay and shape it with his hands. Each newly formed piece then had to undergo a critical drying period, often lasting several days, to slowly evaporate all the moisture from the clay body. Rushing this step was unthinkable. Trapped water would turn to steam in the kiln's heat, Chinese letter ing with explosive force and shattering not only the offending pot but often its neighbors as well. Once bone dry, the pieces were ready for the most anxious part of the process, the loading of the kiln. This was a skill in itself, a three-dimensional puzzle of nesting bowls, propping plates, and standing tiles on their edges to maximize space while ensuring the flames could reach everywhere. The most precious, finely made pieces were often given the prime spots in the center of the chamber, where the heat was most even and stable. The firing itself was a multi-day ritual of intense focus. After the kiln was sealed, a small, gentle fire was lit to begin the final drying process, a stage called the water smoking period. Over the next 12 to 24 hours, the temperature was gradually and relentlessly increased. The kiln master and his apprentices would work in shifts, day and night, constantly feeding the fire and staring into the spy holes to read the color of the flames and the glow of the ceramics inside. They knew that a deep red glow meant one temperature, while an orange-yellow indicated another, and a blinding white heat signaled the peak of the firing. There were no thermometers. This knowledge was entirely empirical, passed down through generations and learned through painful experience. The climax of the firing could reach temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to sinter the clay particles together, permanently transforming the soft, fragile material into hard, durable ceramic. After the firing was complete, the kiln was sealed shut and left to cool for another 2 or 3 days. Opening it was a moment of high drama, a reveal that would judge the potter's skill and determine his family's income for the coming weeks. A successful firing yielded a kiln full of beautiful, ringing hard pottery. A failure from a sudden downdraft, a miscalculation in fuel, or an unseen flaw in the clay could mean a week's worth of labor reduced to a pile of broken, overfired waste. The economic importance of this entire arduous process cannot be overstated. Pottery was the plastic of the Middle Ages, an indispensable material for daily life. Every household, from the poorest serf's hut to the king's great hall, relied on ceramic vessels for storing water, grain, and salted meats, for cooking stews over the fire, for serving food and drink, and for dining. It was a ubiquitous technology, and its production was a major cottage industry. Furthermore, pottery was a key trade good. The distinctive shapes and glazes from certain regions, like the green glazed ware from Saintonge in France or the gritty cooking pots from the Rhineland, have been found by archaeologists hundreds of miles from their points of origin, tracing out the vibrant trade routes of medieval Europe. But these kilns were more than just factories for functional ware. They were also crucibles of artistic expression. The application of glazes made from powdered minerals suspended in water turned simple parts into canvases. A lead-based glaze could produce a clear, shiny coating, while adding copper would result in a vibrant green, and iron oxide would yield rich browns and ambers. Potters developed regional styles, their designs reflecting local tastes and available materials. In England, medieval kilns produced splendid floor tiles with stamped and inlaid designs of heraldic beasts and geometric patterns that still adorn cathedral floors today. A simple jug could be adorned with a thumb-pressed pattern or a trailed line of white slip clay, a personal signature from the artisan. Through the transformative power of the kiln, the most humble material on earth, clay, was elevated into an object of durability, utility, and often astonishing beauty. While the potter's kiln created objects of daily use and beauty, another type of kiln was performing a far more foundational, yet often invisible, alchemy, one that literally held the medieval world together. If you stand today and look up at the soaring vaults of a Gothic cathedral or the mighty walls of a stone castle, you are not just looking at skillfully stacked rock. You are witnessing the triumph of chemistry, a miracle of transformation wrought by the lime kiln. This humble, often overlooked structure was the silent partner to the quarry and the mason's yard, and without its product, those monumental structures would have been little more than unstable piles of stone, vulnerable to collapse and the relentless pull of gravity. The magic ingredient was lime mortar, and its creation began with a seemingly ordinary rock, limestone, quarried from pits across the countryside. This pale, chalky stone was loaded into the belly of a specially designed lime kiln. These kilns were typically simple, robust structures, often built directly into a hillside for support and insulation. They featured a large firing chamber where the limestone chunks were carefully stacked, and a firebox at the base where an intense, sustained fire was built, usually with vast quantities of high-quality charcoal to ensure a clean, hot burn. The process, known as calcination, required maintaining a scorching temperature of around 900 degrees Celsius for days on end. Inside this inferno, a simple yet profound chemical reaction took place. The heat drove the carbon dioxide out of the calcium carbonate in the limestone, leaving behind a new, highly reactive substance called quicklime or calcium oxide. This new substance was the key to everything, but it was also incredibly dangerous. When the firing was complete and the kiln was cooled, the resulting quicklime emerged not as a rock, but as a crumbly, white, crystalline material that seemed to hold a latent, violent energy within it. The next step was called slaking, and it was a dramatic and hazardous procedure that had to be managed with extreme care. The quicklime was carefully transferred to a pit and then mixed with water. The moment the two met, a furious reaction erupted. The mixture would hiss, steam, and boil violently, releasing tremendous heat that could easily cause severe burns. This exothermic reaction transformed the quicklime into calcium hydroxide, a wet, putty-like slurry known as slaked lime. This slurry was then mixed with sand and water to create the final product, lime mortar. The challenges of this entire process were immense and constant. Achieving and maintaining the consistent, intense heat required for calcination was a delicate art. If the temperature dropped too low, the limestone would only be partially converted, resulting in a weak and useless mortar. If the fire got too hot or uneven, it could vitrify the limestone or the kiln lining itself, ruining the batch and potentially damaging the kiln. And the handling of quicklime was a job that demanded respect and caution. The fine dust was highly caustic. If inhaled, it could burn the lungs, and any contact with skin or eyes could cause serious injury. The slaking process itself was so violent that an unwary worker could be scalded by the erupting slurry. This was not a trade for the careless. It was a precise and perilous chemical industry operating at the very edge of medieval understanding. Yet, the reward for mastering this dangerous alchemy was a building material of revolutionary power. When the lime mortar was placed between stones and began to dry, it initiated its final transformation. As it absorbed carbon dioxide from the air, it slowly began to harden through a process called carbonation, essentially turning back into solid calcium carbonate, the same material as the original limestone, but now acting as a powerful, crystalline glue that bonded the stones into a single, monolithic structure. Unlike the simple clay or mud mortars used in cruder buildings, lime mortar was durable, weather-resistant, and could withstand immense compressive weight, making it the indispensable heart of all grand medieval construction. It allowed masons to build thinner, taller, and more ambitious walls. It secured the delicate tracery of window frames and the complex ribs of vaulted ceilings. Every stone block in a cathedral, from the deepest foundation to the highest spire, was locked in place by this man-made rock. The lime kiln, therefore, was the essential bridge between the quarry and the cathedral. It was the unsung hero of medieval engineering, a factory of artificial stone that enabled the era's most breathtaking architectural achievements. The great master builders like William of Sense, who designed Canterbury Cathedral, were not just architects and stonemasons, they were also masters of material science, understanding intimately the properties of the mortar that would hold their visions together. The fiery transformation within the lime kiln made the spiritual ambition of reaching towards the heavens a physical reality, proving that the most enduring monuments of the medieval world were built not just on stone, but on a foundation of controlled fire and chemical ingenuity. But the blacksmith's forge, for all its vital importance to village life, was a generalist's workshop for the ultimate expression of the metalworker's art, for the creation of objects where a millimeter's error could mean the difference between life and death. One must step into the specialized domain of the armorer. Here, the hammer's ring took on a more urgent tone, and the forge's fire was tuned to a far more precise and demanding purpose, not just to shape metal, but to defy it, to craft a second skin that could turn aside a sword's slash or a lance's thrust. The armorer's workshop was a place of supreme specialization, where the raw power of the smithy was refined into an intricate ballet of metallurgy, engineering, and artistic expression. The process began not at the anvil, but with the selection and preparation of the metal itself. While a village smith worked with readily available wrought iron, the armorer sought out the highest quality steel he could acquire, often through long-distance trade. This steel, with its higher carbon content, had the potential to be hardened through heating and quenching, transforming it from a merely tough material into an incredibly resilient one. The first and most iconic product of this craft was mail armor, often called chainmail. This was a monument to patience and skill. The armorer would first draw iron wire by pulling a rod through successively smaller holes in a steel drawplate, a grueling process that often required the power of a water mill. This wire was then coiled around a rod and cut into individual rings, each one a perfect circle. The real magic came in the linking. Each ring was interlocked with 4 others and then riveted shut with a tiny pin, a task that demanded phenomenal dexterity and eyesight. A single shirt of mail, a hauberk, could contain over 20,000 individually riveted rings, representing months of meticulous labor. The result was a flexible, surprisingly effective defense that could disperse the energy of a cutting blow across hundreds of interlocking links. As weapon technology evolved, so too did armor. The rise of powerful crossbows and lances designed to punch through mail led to the development of plate armor. This was the armorer's masterpiece, the pinnacle of his craft. Shaping a solid sheet of steel into a complex, anatomically accurate shell was an incredible challenge. Primary technique was called raising. Starting with a heavy, flat plate, the armorer would heat it and then hammer it over a series of rounded stakes set into his anvil, gradually dishing and curving the metal through countless careful blows. To create a helmet or a breastplate, he would often work from both sides, alternating between hammering it into a hollow and then annealing it, reheating it to soften the metal and relieve the stress caused by all that hammering, which could otherwise make the steel brittle and prone to cracking. This was a slow, deliberate dance of heat and hammer, requiring an intuitive understanding of how the metal would move and stretch. The goal was to create a shape that was strong, deflective, and crucially, allowed for freedom of movement. A well-made suit of plate was not the clunky, restrictive cage of popular myth. It was an ergonomic marvel with articulated lames at the joints that allowed a knight to run, mount his horse, and even perform cartwheels. The true secret of the armorer's art, however, lay in the final, most dramatic step, heat treatment. After a piece was shaped, it had to be hardened. The armorer would heat the steel to a critical temperature, judged by the specific color of its glow. A brilliant cherry red or a pale yellow, and then quench it instantly in a trough of water or oil. This rapid cooling locked the steel's crystalline structure into an extremely hard state, but this hardness came with a cost: brittleness. A breastplate hardened in this way might stop a lance but could shatter like glass from a heavy blow from a mace. The solution was tempering. The armorer would gently reheat the hardened piece, often in the dying embers of his forge or a bed of hot sand, carefully watching as the surface bloomed with a spectrum of colors: pale yellows, deep blues, purples, and browns. Each color corresponded to a specific temperature and thus a specific level of toughness. He would quench it again the moment it reached the desired hue, perhaps a pale straw color for the sharp edge of a gauntlet's cuff or a blue tinge for the springy steel of a helmet, perfectly balancing hardness with resilience. This was not science as we know it with precise temperature gauges. It was science written in fire and color, a knowledge passed down through generations and guarded fiercely. This profound understanding of materials and the human form gave rise to distinct regional schools of armorers, each with their own celebrated styles. In the German lands, particularly in centers like Augsburg and Nuremberg, the style was what we now call Gothic armor. It was characterized by its elegant, fluted design. These sharp, vertical ridges were not merely decorative. They acted like the corrugations in sheet metal, adding immense structural strength without adding significant weight, allowing the armor to be made from thinner, more mobile plates. Italian armor from great cities like Milan often had a smoother, more rounded and robust appearance, favoring broader surfaces and a heavier, more imposing look that offered maximum protection for the tournament field. These regional identities were badges of honor and markers of quality, and a knight would often have his armor commissioned from a famous workshop hundreds of miles away, a testament to the international reputation of these master craftsmen. Ultimately, the armorer's creation was a paradox forged in steel. It was a tool of war designed for the brutal reality of the battlefield, yet it was also one of the highest forms of peacetime art. A finished suit was often blued, gilded, or etched with intricate designs, scenes from mythology or delicate scrollwork, turning the wearer into a walking canvas. It was a symbol of immense status and wealth, but its primary purpose was the deeply personal one of preservation. In the armorer's forge, the relentless pursuit of perfect function inevitably gave rise to breathtaking beauty. Every graceful curve was designed to deflect a weapon, every gleaming surface was polished to spot a foe, and every articulated joint was engineered for the fluidity of combat. The armorer was both engineer and artist, anatomist and metallurgist, and his workshop was where a knight's life, his honor, and his very identity were literally fashioned from fire and iron. Yet for all the noise and fire of the armorer's forge and the dramatic chemical transformation of the lime kiln, the story of medieval craftsmanship has long been told with a crucial, quiet absence. When we picture these workshops, our minds instinctively conjure images of men, burly smiths with soot-streaked faces, monks bent over manuscripts, potters shaping clay with strong, sure hands. This image, however, is incomplete. It overlooks the essential, often unheralded contributions of women, who are not merely bystanders in this world of industry but active, indispensable participants whose hands helped shape the very fabric of medieval material life. Their story is one woven not in the grand tapestries of guild halls, but in the subtle threads of household accounts, court records, and the quiet, continuous labor of the family workshop. The most common and vital role for women was within the context of the family business, the economic backbone of medieval craft. In a world where the workshop was often physically attached to the home, the line between domestic duty and commercial production was beautifully and practically blurred. A blacksmith's wife or daughter was never just a homemaker, she was a crucial part of the production line. While her husband focused on the skilled work at the anvil, she would likely be the one managing the bellows, a tiring but critical job that required a keen sense of rhythm to maintain the consistent air blast needed for the fire. She would be responsible for the initial sorting of materials, the preparation of charcoal, and the finishing of pieces, tasks like polishing cooled metal, applying protective oils to prevent rust, or wrapping handles on finished tools. In the potter's household, women were frequently involved in the wedging and preparation of the clay, ensuring it was of a perfect, uniform consistency, free of air pockets and pebbles. They might specialize in applying the slips and glazes, their artistic touch defining the final appearance of the ware. This wasn't helping out, it was an integral division of labor that made the family enterprise viable. The success of the master craftsman was almost always built upon the supported and skilled labor of the women in his household, their work allowing him to focus on the most specialized aspects of the trade. Perhaps the most significant avenue for female autonomy in these trades came through widowhood. Medieval guild regulations, while overwhelmingly patriarchal, often contained provisions that protected a master's widow. It was common practice for a woman to inherit her husband's workshop, tools, and most importantly, his right to operate the business. This allowed her to become a femme sole, a woman operating legally in her own name. She could take on apprentices, hire journeymen, and fulfill contracts, effectively becoming the master of the forge or kiln in her own right. Historical records from cities like London, Paris, and Frankfurt are dotted with such examples. The archives of the Cologne guilds, for instance, list women like Heilwig, identified in the late 13th century as a smither, a female smith, operating her own workshop. In the English town of Dartford, a woman named Christiana is recorded as a potester, a female potter, likely running her late husband's business. These women were not just keeping the seat warm until a man could take over. They were capable business owners, managing complex operations, negotiating with suppliers, and ensuring the quality of the work that left their shop. Their presence in the records, though sparse, is powerful proof that women could and did achieve a level of professional mastery and economic independence. Uncovering these stories requires reading between the lines of history, looking past the formal guild memberships that were almost exclusively male. Evidence of their work appears in less formal documents. Court rolls might mention a woman being sued for a debt related to her ironmongery business or a contract for delivering a batch of tiles. Wills often bequeath specific tools to daughters, not just sons, indicating their expected role in the trade. Archaeological evidence can also hint at their presence. The smaller, more delicate tools sometimes found in workshops could suggest their use by individuals with different physical statures, perhaps women or older children. What emerges from this patchwork of evidence is a clear picture. Medieval industry was a collective household effort. The iconic image of the lone male genius craftsman is a myth. Behind every master smith or potter was a network of support, and very often that network was held together by the knowledge, labor, and business acumen of women. Recognizing this reality does more than just add a few new names to the historical record. It fundamentally changes our understanding of how medieval society worked. It reveals the workshop not as a masculine sanctuary, but as a shared, familial space where skills were passed from mother to daughter, as well as from father to son. It shows us that the economic engine of the age was fueled by a partnership of labor, even if only one partner's name was officially recorded. By bringing these women out of the historical shadows, we see a more nuanced, inclusive, and accurate picture of the past, one where the mastery of wind and flame was an achievement shared by an entire household. a quiet collaboration that built the world one fire, one piece, and one generation at a time. But who ensured that the armor on a knight's back or the mortar holding up a cathedral wall was trustworthy? In a world without modern quality controls or international standards, the answer lay in one of the most powerful and enduring institutions of the medieval era, the craft guild. These were not simple trade unions or social clubs. They were the absolute regulators of quality, the gatekeepers of knowledge, and the architects of the entire economic landscape for artisans like blacksmiths, potters, and armorers. The rise of the guild system transformed craftsmanship from a collection of isolated skills into a respected, standardized, and protected profession, creating a framework that would dominate European industry for centuries. Imagine you are a wealthy burgher in 14th century London, needing to commission an iron gate for your new townhouse. You wouldn't simply go to the cheapest smith. You'd seek out a master who was a member of the worshipful company of blacksmiths. That membership was your guarantee. The guild's primary function was to protect its reputation, and it did this by ruthlessly enforcing strict standards on every aspect of production. Guild regulations, often lengthy documents approved by the town council, dictated everything. They specified the exact quality and type of iron that could be used, preventing masters from cutting corners with inferior imported ore. They prescribed techniques, ensuring that a sword was properly tempered and a pot was fired to the correct hardness. They even set maximum and minimum prices, preventing cutthroat competition that could drive down quality and also protecting consumers from price gouging. To enforce these rules, guild wardens possessed the power to conduct surprise inspections of any workshop. They could examine finished goods, test the strength of a blade, or check the composition of an alloy. A smith found using substandard materials or a potter selling underfired, leaky ware faced severe penalties, hefty fines, public shaming, the destruction of his faulty merchandise, or even expulsion from the guild, which was effectively a death sentence for his business. This system created a powerful culture of trust. A customer knew that a guild-approved mark stamped on a piece of metal or etched on the base of a pot was a seal of quality, a promise that the item would perform as expected. This obsession with quality began not with the finished product, but with the training of the artisan who made it. The guild system formalized skill acquisition through a rigorous, multi-tiered journey that every aspiring craftsman had to undertake, the apprenticeship. A boy, and it was almost always a boy, typically from a family that could afford the fees, would be formally indentured to a master craftsman around the age of 12 or 14. His parents would sign a contract binding him to the master for a set term, usually 7 years. In exchange for his labor, the master provided not just training, but food, lodging, clothing, and a kind of paternal discipline. The apprentice's life was one of humble servitude. His first years were spent on the most mundane tasks, sweeping the workshop floor, managing the bellows for hours on end, cleaning tools, and running errands. This wasn't mere drudgery, it was a deliberate process of immersion. By constantly observing the master and the journeyman at work, the apprentice absorbed the rhythms and culture of the craft. Slowly, he would graduate to more complex jobs, a basic forging, preparing clay, or applying simple finishes. The master was legally and morally obligated to teach the mysteries of his craft, the secret techniques, the proprietary recipes for glazes or alloys, the tricks of temperature control that gave his work its superior quality. This system ensured that knowledge was not lost but was passed down in a structured, reliable way, generation after generation. Only after successfully completing his 7-year term would an apprentice undergo a review by the guild masters. If they found his skills satisfactory, he was released from his indenture and became a journeyman, from the French journée, meaning day, as he was now paid a daily wage for his labor. But his training was not over. A journeyman was expected to travel or go on his wander years, moving from town to work in different masters' shops. This was a brilliant innovation. It prevented skills from becoming stagnant and inbred within a single town. A journeyman smith from Cologne might learn a new tempering technique in Milan or a more efficient furnace design in York. He would bring these ideas with him as he traveled, cross-pollinating knowledge across Europe and fostering a continent-wide wave of innovation. After several years of travel and saving his wages, a journeyman with ambition would seek to become a master himself. This required creating a masterpiece, an original work of exceptional quality that demonstrated his complete command of the craft. For a blacksmith, this might be an elaborate wrought iron gate; for a potter, a large, intricately glazed vase; for an armorer, a complete helmet with articulated visor. He would present this piece to the guild masters for judgment, if they deemed it worthy, and if he could afford the steep entrance fees and host a lavish banquet for the existing masters, he would finally be admitted into their ranks, allowed to open his own workshop, take on his own apprentices, and add his own unique mark to the legacy of his craft. Beyond regulating commerce and training, guilds functioned as a comprehensive social safety net in an era before such a concept existed. They were, in essence, the first fraternal benefit societies. Membership dues were used to create a common fund that supported members and their families through life's inevitable crises. If a master craftsman fell ill and could not work, the guild would provide financial assistance to his family. If he was injured in a workshop accident, the guild would cover his medical expenses. If he died, the guild would ensure he received a proper burial and, most importantly, would provide ongoing support for his widow and young children, often helping the widow maintain the business, as we discussed earlier. This system created a powerful sense of community and mutual obligation. Guild members were expected to attend each other's weddings and funerals, contribute to charitable causes, and even pray for the souls of deceased members. This intertwining of the economic, the social, and the spiritual made the guild more than just a business association. It was a second family, a source of identity and security in a precarious world. It bound masters together not just by trade, but by a shared commitment to preserving their way of life, ensuring that the master of wind and flame was never left to face the storms of fate alone. They possessed no thermocouples, no pyrometers, no understanding of the atomic excitement that defined heat. Yet, a master smith staring into his forge or a potter watching his kiln could gauge temperature with an accuracy that would astonish us today. Theirs was a science written not in textbooks, but in the subtle, shifting language of light and flame. They operated with a deep, empirical knowledge, a hard-won understanding built upon centuries of careful observation, painful failure, and brilliantly passed-down tradition. The color of the metal itself was their primary guide. They knew that a deep, dull red glow signaled a heat sufficient only for slow, gentle bending. A bright cherry red meant the iron was plastic and ready for serious forging. But when that glow shifted to a brilliant orange yellow, they knew the metal was approaching its most malleable state, perfect for welding. And the ultimate signal, a blinding, almost white-hot incandescence, was reserved for the most critical operations, like casting a temperature they knew to avoid for most steelwork lest they burn the carbon out and ruin the metal. This chromatic scale was their thermometer, and reading it correctly was the difference between a masterpiece and a pile of scrap. This empirical knowledge extended far beyond mere color. They were intimate with the personality of every fuel. They knew that dry, seasoned oak charcoal would burn hotter and cleaner than resinous pine, which could leave a sticky, contaminating residue on metal. They understood that peat, though common in some regions, burned with a smoldering, less intense heat that was fine for drying pottery but useless for smelting iron. They learned to listen to the fire itself, the roar of a well-drafted blast furnace versus the weak cough of a clogged flue. They could feel the heat radiating on their faces and use that sensation to judge the progress inside a sealed kiln. Every sense was engaged in this constant diagnosis. The smell of the fumes could tell a lime burner if his limestone was converting properly. The sound of a hammer strike on cooling metal could tell a smith about its internal crystalline structure. This was a holistic sensory science where the craftsman was a living, breathing instrument of measurement. Where did this profound practical knowledge come from? Much of it was passed down through the oral tradition of master to apprentice, a continuous chain of experiential learning. But we also find it captured in the few precious technical manuscripts that survive, most famously in the work of the 12th century monk Theophilus Presbyter. In his treatise on diverse arts, he doesn't speak in abstract theories. He provides recipes. He gives detailed instructions on how to build a furnace that will achieve the necessary heat for casting bells, how to recognize the right moment to quench a blade by the color of the steel, and how to manage a fire for annealing glass. His writing is a perfect fusion of monastic scholarship and workshop practicality. It shows a mind that is both deeply observant and relentlessly practical, seeking not to explain why heat behaves as it does, but to document how to command it reliably for a desired end. To the modern eye, however, their world was a fascinating tapestry woven with both sharp observation and mystical belief. They lived in a universe informed by classical and Islamic alchemical traditions, which sought to explain material transformations through spiritual and philosophical frameworks. Many artisans likely believed that metals grew in the earth like living things, maturing from base lead into noble silver and finally perfect gold. Fire, in this context, was not just a physical phenomenon but a purifying spiritual force, an element that could accelerate this natural maturation or strip away impurities to reveal a material's true, perfect nature. This belief system did not hinder their practical work. In many ways, it empowered it. It gave them a conceptual framework for understanding why hammering strengthened metal. It drove out the spirits of brittleness, or why quenching hardened steel. It trapped the spirit of hardness within. This blend of the mystical and the practical was their working model of the universe, and it was remarkably effective. We must be careful not to see this as a primitive shortcoming. This intuitive, experience-based grasp of thermal dynamics was a highly sophisticated form of science in action. It was a science of correlation rather than causation. They didn't need to know that temperature correlated to the wavelength of light emitted. They simply knew that a yellow glow meant one thing and a white glow meant another. They didn't need to understand oxidation states to know that a reducing atmosphere lacking oxygen was needed to convert ore to metal, while an oxidizing atmosphere rich in oxygen was needed to burn out impurities. They learned to create these atmospheres by adjusting the draft of their kilns or the depth of their charcoal beds. Their success is a powerful testament to the human capacity to master complex systems through pattern recognition and repetition, long before the underlying principles are formally understood. The towering cathedrals, the resilient armor, and the durable pottery that survive to this day are the undeniable proof of their mastery. They manipulated the elemental force of heat with a confidence born of deep-seated knowledge, proving that one can be a brilliant engineer of fire without ever uttering the word thermodynamics. Yet for all the profound knowledge held within the monastery walls and the guarded secrets of the guild workshops, innovation was never destined to remain local. The most powerful force in spreading the mastery of wind and flame wasn't a manuscript or a single brilliant mind. It was the relentless, bustling, and utterly practical movement of people and goods along the trade routes that crisscrossed medieval Europe. This was an era of surprising connectivity, where a new technique for hardening steel could travel from Damascus to Dresden, or a design for a more efficient kiln could migrate from the Rhineland to the Scottish lowlands, all carried on the backs of merchants, pilgrims, and most importantly, itinerant craftsmen. The medieval world, far from being a collection of isolated villages, was a vibrant melting pot where the sparks of ingenuity, once kindled, could quickly become a wildfire of progress. The primary vectors for this technological diffusion were the craftsmen themselves, particularly journeymen on their wanderjar. As we've seen, the guild system mandated that a young artisan travel to learn new techniques before he could become a master. This formalized wandering turned these journeymen into a continent-wide network of knowledge brokers. A German metalworker might spend a year in a Spanish forge, where he would see firsthand the distinct, advanced techniques developed under Islamic influence. The sophisticated Damascene and Tolden steel-making processes, which involved pattern welding and secret-quenching methods to create blades of legendary sharpness and flexibility, were highly coveted secrets. A journeyman lucky enough to learn even a fraction of these methods would carry that knowledge with him to his next workshop in France or Italy, adapting and integrating it into his own practice. Similarly, Scandinavian methods of iron production, honed in the bog iron-rich regions of Sweden and Norway, traveled with Viking traders and settlers to places like northern England and Ireland, influencing the design of furnaces in those areas. This constant, deliberate migration meant that technological advances were rarely confined to their place of origin for long. They were picked up, carried, and cross-pollinated by this mobile class of highly skilled laborers. Trade goods themselves were another critical medium for spreading innovation. A finished product is a testament to the technology that created it. When a Venetian merchant unloaded a cargo of exceptionally thin, strong, and clear glassware at the port of Bruges, it wasn't just selling luxury items, it was advertising the superior glassmaking technology of Murano. The local glaziers would have eagerly acquired these pieces, not just to sell, but to study, reverse engineer, and attempt to replicate the secrets of their manufacture. The same was true for a finely tempered Flemish sword, a piece of intricate Moorish brasswork, or a particularly durable batch of Spanish tiles. These objects were silent ambassadors of technique, their very existence challenging and inspiring craftsmen elsewhere to improve their own methods. The widespread trade in raw materials was equally important. The distribution of high-quality iron ore from Sweden or Spain, or specific types of clay known for their refractory properties, forced smiths and potters to adapt their techniques to new materials, often leading to unexpected improvements and innovations in the process itself. The great annual fairs of the era, like those in Champagne, Frankfurt, or Lyon, acted as massive, temporary clearinghouses for both goods and ideas. For a few weeks each year, these fairs transformed empty fields into bustling international metropolises, drawing merchants, bankers, and craftsmen from every corner of Christendom and beyond. Here, a blacksmith from York could not only sell his wares but also stroll through the stalls and see the work of his counterparts from Augsburg, Florence, and Cordoba. He could handle their tools, examine the finish on their metalwork, and engage in shop talk, exchanging tips and tricks in a shared language of craft. These fairs were the medieval equivalent of international trade shows and academic conferences rolled into one. They were where new tools, like an improved design for bellows or a more effective type of anvil, made their debut and quickly gained fame. The cross-cultural fertilization that occurred in these chaotic, vibrant marketplaces accelerated the standardization of best practices and rapidly elevated the overall technological level across the continent. This constant flow of people and ideas meant that medieval Europe, for all its political fragmentation, was a remarkably unified technological sphere. A breakthrough in one region rarely remained a secret for more than a generation. The water-powered trip hammer perfected in the German lands quickly spread to mining regions in England and Sweden. Architectural innovations like the flying buttress, which required sophisticated ironwork to hold stone together, moved from northern France to cathedral building sites across Europe, carried by teams of masons and smiths who worked on these grand projects. This free exchange turned local ingenuity into a shared European inheritance, ensuring that the fiery transformation of society was not a series of isolated events, but a synchronized, continent-wide revolution. The master craftsmen of the Middle Ages were, in a very real sense, citizens of a republic of knowledge, their collective progress fueled by the winds of trade and the footsteps of countless curious travelers. Yet for all the brilliant innovation and cross-continental exchange of ideas, this fiery transformation of the medieval world came at a cost, one that was written not in ledgers or manuscripts, but across the very landscape of Europe itself. The insatiable appetite of the forge and the kiln demanded a constant, colossal supply of fuel, and this demand sparked one of history's first great environmental dilemmas: the tension between industrial progress and the preservation of the natural world. The primary culprit was charcoal, the lifeblood of high-temperature industry. To produce just 1 kilogram of iron required the charcoal derived from an astonishing 25 kilograms of wood. When you scale that up to the output of a single, continuously operating water-powered blast furnace, the numbers become staggering. A single furnace might consume the equivalent of an entire acre of mature forest in just 1 week. This voracious consumption began to reshape the European countryside in profound and often devastating ways. The impact, however, was not uniform. In some regions, this immense pressure led to surprisingly sophisticated and early forms of sustainable resource management. Monasteries, with their long-term perspective and meticulous record-keeping, were often pioneers in this area. Cistercian monasteries, in particular, owned vast tracts of woodland and managed them with remarkable foresight. They practiced coppicing, a method where trees like oak, ash, and chestnut are cut down to a stump, encouraging them to send up multiple fast-growing shoots. These shoots could be harvested on a cyclical basis every 7 to 15 years, providing a perpetual, renewable supply of poles and smaller wood perfect for the charcoal clamp. This wasn't forestry for timber, it was forestry for fuel, a deliberate and managed agricultural process designed to feed the industrial furnace without killing the patient. In parts of Germany, France, and England, these managed woodlands became valuable economic assets, carefully tended and passed down through generations, demonstrating a clear understanding that the resource was not infinite. But in other areas, particularly those with concentrated industrial activity, the story was one of outright devastation. The Great Weald Forest in southeastern England, a primary iron-producing region, was dramatically reduced over the medieval period to feed the local furnaces. The same happened in the Ardennes forest in France and parts of the Rhineland in Germany. The consequences of this deforestation extended far beyond the loss of trees. Without deep root systems to hold it in place, soil washed away from hillsides, silting up rivers and streams and causing downstream flooding. The loss of habitat affected game animals, impacting hunting rights, a crucial food source and privilege for many communities. The local climate could even be affected, becoming windier, and more prone to temperature extremes without the moderating influence of the forest canopy. This wasn't just an environmental change, it was a social and economic crisis that threatened the very livelihoods of those who depended on the forest for survival. This growing crisis did not go unnoticed. By the High Middle Ages, authorities began to enact some of the world's earliest environmental protection laws. In England, forest laws, originally designed by Norman kings to protect hunting grounds for the aristocracy, were gradually adapted to regulate the cutting of wood for industrial purposes. Royal charters began to specify which woods could be used for charcoal and which were protected. In 13th century Siena, Italy, the city government passed strict ordinances prohibiting the cutting of trees within a certain radius of the city to protect the watershed and prevent erosion. Penalties for illegal logging could be severe, including heavy fines and even imprisonment. These regulations show a clear, albeit nascent, awareness of sustainability. They recognized that the unchecked consumption of woodlands threatened not only industry itself by destroying its fuel source, but also the stability of the entire community. It was a pragmatic understanding that progress could not be built upon a foundation of its own ruin. This inevitably led to intense conflicts over resources. Iron masters, who held royal licenses and provided the essential materials for weapons and tools, often clashed with local villagers whose common rights, the ancient privileges to gather firewood, forage for food, and graze their pigs in the forest, were being erased by the charcoal burner's axe. These weren't mere disputes, they were battles over two competing ways of life. Court records from the period are filled with lawsuits from communities protesting the enclosure of common woodlands for industrial use. The forest, which had once been a shared resource for all, was increasingly being seen as a commodity to be consumed by the few for industrial gain. This historical struggle echoes down to our own time, a poignant reminder that the debate between economic development and environmental preservation is not a modern invention. The medieval experience with deforestation offers a powerful and sobering lesson. It shows us that industrialization in any age has an environmental cost. The great cathedrals, the gleaming suits of armor, and the sturdy plows that defined the era were literally forged from consumed forests, but it also shows a dawning awareness of the need for balance. The managed coppices and the early conservation laws represent humanity's first stumbling steps toward the concept of sustainability. They understood in a visceral way that you could not have endless progress from a finite resource. The masters of wind and flame were not just innovators, they were also among the first to confront the consequences of their own success, teaching us that true mastery lies not only in harnessing nature's power, but also in learning to preserve it. To truly grasp the reach of these technologies, we must step beyond the workshop and into the rhythm of daily medieval life, where the products of the forge and kiln were not luxuries but the very pillars of existence. From the moment a farmer rose at dawn, his day was shaped by fire and iron. The plowshare that sliced through the stubborn, cold earth was forged by the village smith, its sharp edge turning the soil to sow the seeds that would feed the community. The axe that felled the trees for a new home, the hammer that drove the nails to hold its frame together, the sickle that harvested the grain, and the scythe that cut hay for livestock, every one of these essential tools began as a bloom of iron, painstakingly worked into shape at the anvil. Without the blacksmith's craft, agriculture on any meaningful scale would have ground to a halt. Society would have reverted to subsistence foraging, utterly dependent on the whims of nature. The forge didn't just make metal objects, it made settled, agricultural life possible. Inside the home, the kiln's contributions were equally vital, though often even less celebrated. Every household, from the humblest peasant's cottage to the bustling kitchen of a manor lord, relied on an array of kiln-fired ceramics. Large, sturdy storage jars known as crocks preserved precious grains, salted meats, and pickled vegetables through the long winter months, a critical defense against famine. Cooking pots, designed to withstand direct heat from the hearth fire, simmered stews and porridges that formed the core of the medieval diet. Juglets and pitchers carried and served water, ale, and milk, while bowls and trenchers were the plates from which families ate their meals. This pottery was so commonplace, so utterly integrated into the daily acts of eating, drinking, and storing, that it became invisible, a technological constant that was only noticed in its absence. A broken pot was not just a minor inconvenience, it was a genuine economic loss and a threat to a family's food security, necessitating a trip to the local potter and a dip into scarce resources. The kiln, through its humble products, provided the material foundation for nutrition and domestic organization. Beyond the sheer utility of their products, these workshops and their masters occupied a unique and multifaceted social role, with the village blacksmith standing as perhaps the most central figure. His forge was more than a workshop. It was a community hub, one of the warmest and most visited places in the village, especially during the bitter cold of winter. It was a natural gathering spot where news was exchanged, gossip was shared, and local disputes were often hashed out under the smith's unofficial mediation. His strength and steady nature often lent him an air of authority, but his role extended far beyond metalworking. With his knowledge of tools and mechanics, he was the village's first mechanic, repairing everything from a broken wagon wheel to a complicated latch on a door. With his strong hands and familiarity with hot metal and pliers, he often took on the grim task of the village dentist, extracting aching teeth from grateful, if terrified, patients. In some communities, he even served as the informal veterinarian, shoeing horses and tending to livestock ailments. This placed the blacksmith in a position of profound trust and importance. He was a figure who touched the lives of every single person in the parish, a craftsman, a problem solver, and a pillar of the community, all rolled into one. This ubiquity meant that the sound of the hammer on the anvil and the smell of wood smoke from the kiln were the background sensory experiences of the medieval world. They were the ambient noises of progress and stability. A traveling merchant approaching a new village would listen for the familiar ring of the smithy to gauge the settlement's prosperity. The sight of a kiln's smoke plume on the horizon signaled a community capable of producing its own building materials and domestic wares, a mark of self-sufficiency. These technologies were so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that they defined the very character and capabilities of a community. Their presence allowed for specialization, trade, and the accumulation of wealth beyond mere subsistence. The manor lord's kiln, firing fine floor tiles for his chapel or decorative bricks for his great hall, was a statement of status and refinement, but it was built upon the same essential principles as the potter's kiln producing a peasant's cooking pot. One was for luxury, the other for survival, but both were branches of the same technological tree. This pervasive integration reveals the true depth of their impact. The mastery of wind and flame did not just create objects, it built the material ecosystem that made medieval society function, an indispensable network of skills and tools that supported life from the ground up. But perhaps the most breathtaking alchemy of all, the point where the kiln's transformative power reached its most sublime and spiritual expression, was in the creation of stained glass. Here, the artisan's goal was not merely to create a durable object or a sharp tool, but to capture and transmute light itself, to build with brilliance and color. The great Gothic cathedrals, those stone skeletons reaching for the heavens, would have been dark, cavernous spaces without the jewel-like radiance of their windows. These were not just decorations, they were luminous storybooks, theological lessons, and portals to the divine, all made possible by a master glazier's intimate command of the kiln's fiery heart. The process began with a seemingly humble mixture of three essential ingredients: silica, soda, and lime. Silica, usually from pure river sand, formed the glass's backbone. Soda, often derived from the ashes of burned seaweed or specific desert plants, acted as a flux, dramatically lowering the melting point of the stubborn silica. And lime, added either as crushed limestone or present in the ash itself, provided the crucial chemical stability that prevented the finished glass from dissolving when exposed to water, a flaw known as being weeping or sick glass. These three components were carefully weighed according to a secret recipe, the first of many guarded mysteries, and then mixed into a homogeneous batch. This dry, unassuming powder held the potential for transparency, waiting only for the kiss of the furnace to unlock it. The glazier's kiln, or glass furnace, was a specialized and precisely tuned instrument. The mixed batch was loaded into large, durable clay pots called crucibles, which were then placed into the white-hot belly of the furnace. Maintaining the exact temperature was a days-long exercise in intense focus. Too cool, and the mixture would never fully fuse into a homogeneous liquid, remaining a useless, grainy sludge. Too hot, and the molten glass could become too fluid, boiling and developing tiny bubbles that would shatter its clarity, or worse, it could corrode and break through the clay crucible itself, ruining the entire batch and potentially destroying the furnace lining. The master glassmaker would constantly monitor the melt, judging its readiness by dipping an iron rod into the seething, glowing liquid to see how it gathered and flowed, waiting for the moment it reached a thick, honey-like consistency, perfect for working. It was at this molten stage that the magic of color was introduced. The clear base glass, known as pot metal, was transformed into a palette of heavenly hues through the addition of tiny amounts of metal oxides. This was the glazier's true arcane knowledge, a chemistry of brilliance passed down from master to apprentice. Adding cobalt oxide would produce a deep, rich sapphire blue, the most expensive and prized color. Copper compounds could create a stunning range from emerald green to a fiery ruby red. Gold chloride was used to produce a beautiful cranberry pink or violet. The exact proportions, the combination of materials, and even the specific atmospheric conditions inside the kiln, whether the fire was oxidizing or reducing, could affect the final color. These recipes were more precious than gold, the most closely guarded trade secrets of the craft, ensuring a master's reputation and his workshop's prosperity. Once colored, the molten glass was gathered on the end of a long blowpipe by a skilled gaffer. In a breathtaking display of dexterity, he would blow into the pipe, forming a large, elongated bubble of glass. This bubble was then manipulated, swung, and rolled on a mava table until it formed a long, hollow cylinder. After being sliced open lengthwise and carefully reheated, this cylinder was laid flat in a kiln to anneal, slowly cooling into a roughly textured sheet of colored glass. The technical challenges in creating these sheets were immense. Achieving a consistent thickness was nearly impossible. Early medieval glass is famously full of waves and bubbles, which ironically catch the light in dynamic, living ways that modern flat glass cannot. Creating large panels of a single, uniform color was incredibly difficult, which is why master glaziers became experts at cutting the glass into hundreds of small pieces and leading them together like a luminous jigsaw puzzle. This is where the artistry truly ascended. The glazier, working from a full-scale cartoon drawn on a whitewashed table, would select pieces of colored glass and cut them to shape using a hot iron to score and break them. Then, using a griselle, a paint made from ground glass and metal oxides mixed with a binder, he would paint the details, facial features, folds of cloth, leaves on trees. This painted glass was then fired again in a smaller kiln, a critical step that permanently fused the delicate painting to the surface of the glass, making it an integral part of the window. Finally, the individual pieces were fitted into H-shaped channels of lead, soldered together, and supported by a rigid iron armature called a ferramenta, which held the entire massive window securely within the stone opening. The result was not just a window, but a wall of light, a narrative written in fire and color. As sunlight streamed through, it didn't just illuminate the interior, it became the interior, transforming the very air into a kaleidoscope of sacred reds, divine blues, and heavenly golds. The stories of saints and scriptures, once confined to expensive manuscripts only the clergy could read, were now visible to every illiterate peasant who walked into the cathedral, teaching theology through awe and beauty. Through the kiln's transformative fire, common sand and metal were sanctified, becoming a medium of both breathtaking artistry and profound devotion, proving that the greatest masterpieces of the Middle Ages were not carved from stone, but breathed from flame and light. So if the fiery workshops of the Middle Ages built their own world, what became of their legacy when the last embers cooled and the era drew to a close? The remarkable truth is that it never truly ended. The technologies of wind and flame did not vanish with the arrival of the Renaissance. Instead, they provided the essential, solid foundation upon which the entire modern world was later constructed. The great leaps forward of the 15th and 16th centuries, the artistic flourishing, the global exploration, the scientific revolution were all built upon a bedrock of medieval industry. You cannot cast a massive bronze cannon to outfit a king's warship without the large-scale furnaces and refined metalworking techniques perfected by medieval founders. You cannot print books with movable type without the consistent, high-quality alloys for the type metal, a direct descendant of the smith's understanding of lead and tin. You cannot build the vast, towering domes of Renaissance cathedrals without the advanced lime mortars and iron reinforcement ties that medieval masons had spent centuries perfecting. The Renaissance did not spring from a vacuum of renewed classical learning alone. It was equally born from the practical, soot-stained ingenuity of the medieval forge and kiln, which had already solved the fundamental problems of materials and power. This direct lineage is perhaps most clearly visible in the story of the blast furnace. The medieval development of water-powered bellows was the critical breakthrough that allowed furnaces to reach temperatures high enough to produce liquid cast iron. This was a transformative shift from the laborious process of hammering out wrought iron from a bloom. Once masters could pour iron like water into molds, a new world of possibilities opened up. Throughout the late medieval period, these furnaces grew larger and more efficient, their designs continuously refined. By the 16th century, these had evolved into the massive, permanent blast furnaces that began to dot the European landscape, particularly in England's Weald Forest and the German states. Their output was staggering, producing not just pots and pans, but also the first truly mass-produced iron goods, firebacks for hearths, weights for clocks, and perhaps most significantly, cannonballs and shot for the increasingly gunpowder-driven battlefields of Europe. This burgeoning iron industry, with its insatiable appetite for charcoal, was the direct progenitor of the coal and coke-fired furnaces of the 18th century. When Abraham Darby famously first used coke to smelt iron at Coalbrookdale in 1709, he was not inventing a new process. He was simply adapting a centuries-old furnace design to a new, more abundant fuel source to solve the very medieval problem of deforestation. The Industrial Revolution's iron heart did not suddenly begin beating. It was the same heart that had been pounding away in medieval water-powered forges, simply fed a different diet and scaled up to a colossal size. The legacy of medieval power transmission is just as profound. The intricate system of gears, shafts, and cams that translated the rotary motion of a water wheel into the linear pounding of a trip hammer was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. This technology, honed in the hammer mills of the 12th and 13th centuries, represented the world's first widespread use of complex machinery to replace human muscle for industrial tasks. This was the original blueprint for mechanization. The engineers and inventors of the 18th century did not have to dream up the concept of a machine tool from nothing. They had a rich tradition to draw upon. The camshaft that operated a medieval hammer was the direct mechanical ancestor of the one that would later operate the valves in a Newcomen steam engine. The understanding of gear ratios, power transfer, and efficient mechanical design was all worked out empirically by the millwrights and blacksmiths who maintained these industrial complexes. When the time came to harness a new source of power, steam, the knowledge of how to build the necessary machinery already existed, thanks to these medieval pioneers. The factory system, with its centralized power source driving multiple machines, was prefigured in the medieval workshop where a single water wheel might power a set of bellows, a trip hammer, and a grinding stone simultaneously. This continuous thread of innovation utterly dismantles the outdated notion of the Middle Ages as a dark age, a barren period of ignorance squatting between the glories of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. That prejudiced view, largely invented by Enlightenment thinkers seeking to glorify their own time, ignores the overwhelming evidence of technological and intellectual vitality. The medieval period was not an empty pause but a crucial period of incubation and development. It was the era that learned to harness inorganic power on a grand scale, that mastered the chemistry of materials, and that created the economic structures like the guilds that fostered specialized skills. The scientific method itself, often attributed to the Renaissance, has deep roots in the medieval world view of scholars like Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon, who argued that the natural world must be understood through observation and experimentation, a philosophy that was being lived out daily by the kiln master observing the color of his flames and the smith testing the temper of his steel. The legacy of medieval metallurgy is therefore not just a list of inventions, it is a mindset. It is the enduring belief that through careful observation, practical ingenuity, and the relentless application of human creativity, the raw materials of the earth can be transformed and the world itself can be forged into a new and better shape. The masters of wind and flame were the first true engineers of the modern world, and we still live in the civilization they built, one fiery innovation at a time. Perhaps the most persistent and damaging myth we've inherited is the very idea of the Dark Ages, a term that implies a long, bleak period of technological stagnation and intellectual decay following the fall of Rome. This label, popularized by Renaissance thinkers eager to glorify their own rebirth and Enlightenment philosophers who saw the past as a cautionary tale of superstition, has painted over a much more vibrant reality. The narrative suggests that for nearly 1,000 years, humanity simply forgot how to innovate, huddling in crude huts until genius was rediscovered. But when we look closely at the evidence, at the slag heaps of ancient furnaces, the molecular structure of surviving steel, and the precise curves of a cathedral's iron armature, this story completely falls apart. The truth is, the medieval period was not an empty void but a dynamic era of profound and continuous technological adaptation and invention. The masters of wind and flame were not primitive tinkerers. they were sophisticated engineers operating at the very limits of the materials and scientific understanding available to them. Consider the notion of temperature control, a concept we associate with digital pyrometers and advanced thermodynamics. The idea that a medieval potter or smith could reliably achieve and maintain specific high temperatures without any instruments seems, to the modern mind, impossible. Yet they developed an exquisitely calibrated sensory science of heat. A master glassmaker like those working on the windows of Chartres Cathedral didn't need a thermometer to know when his melt was ready for working. He could read the viscosity of the molten glass by how it gathered on the end of an iron rod, and he judged the firing temperature for fusing his painted details by the precise color of the glow inside his kiln. These were not guesses, they were repeatable, teachable skills based on centuries of accumulated observation. Theophilus Presbyter's 12th century manual on diverse arts doesn't speak in vague generalities. It provides specific, detailed recipes that would only work if the practitioner could consistently hit those thermal benchmarks. This was a chemical industry running on empirically proven, if not yet theoretically explained, principles. The production of high-carbon steel is another stunning rebuttal to the myth of primitivism. Creating a sword that was both hard enough to hold a razor edge and flexible enough not to shatter on impact is a metallurgical challenge that many modern blacksmiths still find daunting. It requires an intimate understanding of how carbon interacts with iron at the atomic level, something medieval smiths achieved not through electron microscopes, but through a masterful, intuitive control of their process. They learned to carefully manage the carbon content of their iron through techniques like carburization, where wrought iron was packed in charcoal and heated for extended periods, allowing carbon atoms to diffuse into the metal surface. They then perfected the delicate dance of heat treatment, hardening the steel through quenching, and then drawing back that brittleness through precise tempering, a process guided entirely by the oxidation colors that bloomed on the metal surface. The legendary quality of swords from centers like Toledo in Spain or Passau in Germany wasn't born from magic or accident. It was the result of a rigorous, scientifically grounded craft that could produce a material of exceptional performance, a material we now know was a form of sophisticated composite steel. So why has this image of a backward, technologically stagnant era persisted for so long? The answer lies largely in historical bias. For centuries, the history of technology was written by and for an elite class of scholars who valued theoretical texts over practical application. Because many medieval artisans were illiterate and their knowledge was passed down orally or through hands-on apprenticeship, their achievements were often invisible to the chroniclers of their day. The intellectual snobbery of later eras, particularly the Renaissance, which consciously defined itself in opposition to the immediate past, actively dismissed medieval technology as crude and unworthy of study. Furthermore, the physical evidence of their sophistication, the slag piles, the furnace remains, the fragments of crucible steel, lay buried in the ground, ignored until the advent of modern archaeology. It is only through the meticulous work of archaeologists and materials scientists in the last 50 years, using tools like metallography and radiocarbon dating, that we have begun to truly appreciate the scale and complexity of their industrial endeavors. We've had to literally dig up the proof that the written record overlooked. Dispelling these myths does more than just correct the historical record. It fundamentally changes our understanding of human progress. It reveals a continuous thread of ingenuity where each generation built upon the discoveries of the last. The great innovations of the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution did not appear out of thin air. They were directly built upon the mechanical principles of the water-powered forge, the chemical knowledge of the kiln, and the material science of the smithy. Recognizing the medieval craftsman as a skilled engineer and a sophisticated scientist in his own right is not just an act of historical fairness. It is a tribute to the universal human drive to understand and master the physical world. It honors their legacy not as a curious footnote, but as a foundational chapter in our ongoing story of innovation. For centuries, the story of the medieval craftsman was written only in faded ink on parchment, a tale told through guild records and the occasional surviving artifact. But these written accounts, while valuable, often missed the gritty, physical reality of their world. The soot, the heat, the sheer scale of their industrial ambition. It is only through the patient, meticulous work of modern archaeology that we have finally begun to peel back the layers of earth and time to touch that reality directly. The true scale and complexity of medieval industry lay buried, waiting for the trowel and brush to reveal its secrets, transforming our understanding from a historical footnote into a vivid, sprawling landscape of innovation. Across Europe, the evidence is literally piled high. One of the most telling signs of extensive metalworking is not a finely crafted sword, but a vast, often overlooked mound of waste, the slag heap. To the untrained eye, it's just a pile of rough, dark, glassy rock. But to an archaeologist, a slag heap is a goldmine of information. The chemical composition of the slag can reveal the type of ore that was smelted, and its volume tells a story of staggering productivity. At sites like the Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux in France, or the Viking Age trading center of Ribe in Denmark, excavations have uncovered slag heaps containing thousands of tons of this industrial waste. This isn't evidence of a few occasional firings. This is the detritus of a large-scale, continuous operation, running for decades or even centuries. The size of these mounds forces us to completely recalibrate our perception of medieval output, pointing to an industry that was far more voracious and prolific than we ever imagined from written records alone. Even more revealing than the waste are the excavations of the workshops themselves. At places like West Cotton in England or Borgeby in Sweden, archaeologists have carefully unearthed the remains of sunken featured buildings, workshops partially dug into the ground for insulation and stability. Within these defined spaces, the ghostly impressions of a blacksmith's entire world are preserved in the earth. We find the compacted, fire-hardened floor of the hearth, often layered with centuries of ash and charcoal. We find post holes that once held the massive anvil block, and scattered throughout the floor like a timeline of his work are countless discarded objects, fragments of iron tools that broke during forging, tiny droplets of spilled metal called spatter, and the shattered remains of the clay tires, the nozzles that directed the air blast from the bellows into the fire. Each of these tiny fragments is a data point, helping us reconstruct not just what they made, but how they made it, right down to the specific angles they held their hammers. Perhaps the most thrilling discoveries are the furnaces themselves, often found remarkably intact. At a site in Ledger, Denmark, often associated with the legends of Beowulf, archaeologists uncovered a complex of 7 large iron smelting furnaces, all dating to the late Viking Age. Their careful excavation revealed the sophisticated design, a clay-lined shaft built into a hillside to maximize draft, with clear channels for the tires and a pit for collecting the finished bloom. By analyzing the vitrified, glassy inner walls of these furnaces, scientists can determine the exact temperatures they reached, confirming that medieval smelters could consistently achieve heats well over 1200 degrees Celsius. This isn't guesswork anymore. It's hard, empirical data pulled from the chemistry of the soil itself, proving their technical prowess beyond any doubt. But archaeology does more than just confirm the scale of production. It maps the entire economic ecosystem. the analysis of debris tells a profound story about medieval trade and technological diffusion. For instance, the chemical fingerprint of slag found in a workshop in York might perfectly match the unique signature of iron ore from a specific mine in the Forest of Dean, over 200 miles away. This tells us that raw materials were being transported across astonishing distances through sophisticated trade networks. Similarly, the discovery of specialized tools, like a particular type of drop hammer used for thinning metal, in regions far from their suspected origin, shows how techniques and technologies migrated with itinerant craftsmen. A tool design perfected in the Rhineland could find its way to a rural English forge within a generation, a silent testament to the interconnectedness of the medieval world. Every shovel of dirt turned at these sites is an act of recovery, not just of objects but of people. We find the small, personal things that never made it into the official records: a worn-out leather apron, a honestone for sharpening tools that was carried in a pocket, a simple wooden bowl that held a meal eaten quickly between firings. In one Swedish forge, archaeologists found a small, crudely carved toy horse near the working area, a poignant suggestion that a child was present, perhaps the smith's son or daughter, learning the trade at his side. These intimate finds breathe life into the anonymous figures who populated these workshops. They allow us to hear the echo of their hammer blows, feel the heat of their fires on our faces, and understand that these masters of wind and flame were not just faceless technicians, but people whose skill, patience, and ingenuity were literally forged into the foundation of our modern world, one fire at a time. Yet beyond its smoke and ringing hammer blows, the forge held a far deeper power in the medieval imagination. It became a potent symbol, a rich metaphor that resonated through their stories, their faith, and their very understanding of the world. This was not merely a workshop for mending plows. It was a stage upon which the great dramas of creation, transformation, and even salvation were played out. In an era where most people understood the world through allegory and divine purpose, the elemental process of taking a raw, shapeless lump of metal and refining it with fire and force into a purposeful object was a powerful allegory for the human condition itself. The forge represented the ultimate triumph of order over chaos, of intention over randomness, a physical manifestation of the belief that through struggle and skill, something base could be made noble, something broken could be made whole. This symbolism finds one of its most enduring expressions in the widespread legend of Wale and the Smith, a figure whose story echoes across the Germanic, Norse, and Anglo-Saxon worlds. Wale was no simple village blacksmith. He was a supernatural craftsman, a being of immense, almost magical skill, often said to be the son of a giant. His tale is one of both breathtaking creation and devastating vengeance. In the most famous version, he is captured by a cruel king, who lames him and forces him to work in a secluded forge, producing exquisite treasures for the court. But Wayland's spirit is never broken. From his prison, he orchestrates a terrible and cunning revenge, using his skills to slay the king's sons and craft appalling gifts from their remains, before finally fashioning a set of wings from bird feathers to make his miraculous escape. Wale is a profoundly complex symbol. He embodies the awesome, almost terrifying power of the craftsman, a creator who can also be a destroyer, whose knowledge gives him a form of power that even kings must fear. His story speaks to the medieval reverence for skill, but also a primal anxiety about the transformative power of technology, a force that could be used for both wondrous and horrifying ends. He is the ultimate artisan, whose mastery over metal elevates him to the status of a mythic hero. Within the walls of the monastery, the forge's fire took on a profoundly different, yet equally powerful spiritual meaning. Christian theologians and writers frequently used the imagery of the smithy to describe the process of spiritual refinement and purification. The human soul, in this metaphor, was like a rough piece of iron, full of the impurities of sin, pride, and worldly desire. The trials and tribulations of life, the hardships and sufferings, were the hammer blows of God, intended not to destroy but to shape. The heat of divine love or the fires of penitence were the forces that made the soul malleable, ready to be worked into a more perfect form, worthy of its heavenly purpose. This concept is vividly illustrated in the writings of mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, who described visions where divine truth was revealed in the language of metallurgy. Even the construction of the great cathedrals served as a massive architectural metaphor for this process. The iron ties that held the stone together were literally forged in fire, just as faith was the unseen force that bound the community of believers together against the pressures of the world. The forge thus became a sacred symbol of purgation and redemption, a place where the dross of sin was burned away to reveal the shining soul within. This symbolic weight elevated the blacksmith's very tools into objects of mystical significance. The hammer, an instrument of brute force, became a symbol of divine authority and the power to shape destinies, an association that easily crossed into the realm of the mythological with figures like Thor and his mighty Mjolnir. The anvil, the immutable base that withstands every blow, was seen as a symbol of stability, resilience, and the unwavering foundation of faith. And the fire itself was the most potent symbol of all, a representation of the Holy Spirit's purifying power, of divine inspiration, and of the eternal light of truth. This rich tapestry of meaning ensured that the smith was never viewed as just a laborer. In the eyes of his community, he was a wielder of transformative, almost alchemical power, a man who danced with elemental forces that others could not control. He was part magician, part priest of a very physical craft, and this perception granted him a unique status that hovered somewhere between reverence and cautious fear. Ultimately, the forge's enduring power as a cultural symbol lies in its perfect encapsulation of a fundamental human hope, that suffering and struggle are not meaningless, but are instead the necessary fires that temper the spirit. The medieval world was a hard, often brutal place, filled with disease, war, and uncertainty. The image of the forge offered a compelling narrative to make sense of that hardship. It promised that the hammer blows of fate could, with resilience and faith, forge a stronger self. It was a metaphor for the resilience of the human spirit, a belief that we are not passive victims of circumstance but active participants in our own creation, capable of being shaped by challenge and emerging not broken but refined. This idea gave profound meaning to the daily struggles of medieval life, connecting the physical labor of the smith to the spiritual journey of every individual, making the smoky, noisy, ordinary forge a timeless symbol of transformation and the indomitable will to create meaning from the raw ore of existence. From the humble village forge to the grand monastic kiln, the masters of wind and flame truly transformed civilization. Their innovations in metallurgy and ceramics built the physical world of the Middle Ages and laid the groundwork for future advancements that would one day ripple out to shape our entire modern existence. We've journeyed together through the smoky glow of the bloomery furnace, felt the relentless rhythm of the water-powered trip hammer, and stood in awe before the kilns that turned sand into stained glass and stone into mortar. We've seen how their exquisite control over fire and air enabled the creation of everything from the soaring stonework of cathedral spires to the life-saving embrace of knightly armor, a perfect blend of raw art, intuitive science, and tight-knit community. This story is far more than a tale of tools and techniques. It is a testament to human ingenuity in the face of immense challenge. These artisans, often unnamed and uncelebrated in their own time, were the original engineers, the materials scientists, and the practical physicists of their era. They operated without formal theories or digital instruments, yet they mastered complex chemical processes through observation, patience, and a deep, respectful dialogue with the elements. They understood the personality of every flame, the song of every hammer strike, and the secret language of color that revealed the hidden state of metal and clay. Their legacy is not locked away in museums, it is all around us. The next time you walk past a stone building, consider the lime kiln that made its construction possible. When you see a piece of wrought iron, remember the countless hours of hammering that went into drawing the slag from a spongy bloom. Even the simple ceramic coffee mug you drink from owes its existence to the ancient, fiery alchemy of the kiln. Their work reminds us that progress is not always a sudden explosion of light, but often a slow, steady burn, a cumulative process where each generation stands on the shoulders of the last. The water-powered forge of the 12th century contained the mechanical DNA of the steam engine. The alchemist's quest to understand transformation through fire paved the way for modern chemistry. The medieval workshop, in its relentless pursuit of better tools, stronger materials, and more efficient methods, built the intellectual and technical foundation upon which our entire world now rests. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the fiery heart of the medieval world. If this journey into the past has sparked your curiosity, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the hidden histories that built our world. We'd love to continue this conversation with you down in the comments. Share your thoughts. What medieval innovation or craft from today's video astonishes you the most? Was it the sheer mechanical genius of the water-powered bellows, the patient artistry of the stained glass maker, or the quiet, overlooked contributions of the women in the workshop? Let us know.